Well, welcome back, everyone. Welcome. We're really excited to get things started today. I hope everyone had a eventful day yesterday with the celebration of the French Revolution. We are joined today by a number of prestigious guests. It's to celebrate Jacques Pauwels' most recent book, which you see here. It's also for sale, along with other books by Iskra and a few other titles as well. So don't hesitate to check out all of the books that are available. Jacques Pauwels is a friend of the Critical Theory Workshop, has already done a few interviews, is one of the world's leading historians, and is, I think, occupying a very important position for educating people in a very accessible manner about how to understand history, and more specifically, the history of class struggle. And we're also joined by a very large number of individuals who are doing extremely important things in the realm of publishing. That's the Iskra Books collective, also run Peace, Land, and Bread. They are young, energetic, artistic, politically dedicated, and doing extremely important work for pushing the envelope regarding kind of cultural class struggle. So the protocol for today is I'm going to turn the floor over to Ben to say a few words about Iskra, and then Iskra Books is going to kind of run the show with Jacques as the privileged guest. The very last thing that I'd like to say is that this is the second book in the Critical Theory Workshop's AIM series, so Anti-Imperialist Marxism. And we've been collaborating with Iskra on this project. Torkel Lausen is here, and his book was the first in the series. And we're looking forward to future collaborations along these lines. So definitely check out the series and Iskra's offerings more generally. With no further ado, Ben, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Gabriel and Jennifer, and to our good comrades at Critical Theory Workshop. We're absolutely honored to be here with you, and just, thank you for giving us the space to be here. I'm Ben Stonke. I am the publisher and creative director for Iskra Books and one of the co-founding editors. Since 2017, we've been doing this work. I'm also a professor and a longtime organizer from the US. My PhD is in environmental studies, but at Iskra, I find myself working on the intersection of, critical aesthetics and art and typesetting and all this really cool stuff that kind of gets wrapped into the print work we do. So Iskra Books, we're a nonprofit 501c3 radical publishing house, staffed primarily by volunteers with a very small paid staff, set about to reinvent the work of publishing along lines of organizing and revolutionary work. So we exist to move intellectual work outside the academy and into the hands of organizers and activists actually applying the work to revolutionary struggles, primarily in the imperial core, but beyond as well. We exist to support organizers and to preserve and promote revolutionary work, theory, knowledge, art. We publish primarily theory, history, art, ecology, critical translations, retranslations, and archives of revolutionary movements from around the world, specifically trying to focus on the global South and oppressed peoples and identities. We operate primarily as a reader and not a seller-focused global print press. So what that means is the way we price our texts, we don't aim to give exorbitant $75 texts in the theme of, like the academic presses. We try to price these so they're accessible for organizers and people on the ground. We also do same day of print, free PDFs through our website. So we try to undercut what I see are the really exploitative practices of academic publishing and often radical publishing as well, right? So we're not only fighting the academy, we're trying to do better, do better than what's out there already. So we, I think from the beginning, we've been a design-focused press. All of us are either artists, we're art appreciators, art historians, we're people who appreciate the arts. And when we came onto the scene, what we saw in radical publishing was like a disjuncture between arts and aesthetics and revolutionary work. And so our mission, I think, is to really bring those together, right? So we want to have professional, beautiful works that really speak to the quality of the materials inside the book, right? So we want the outside to match the inside, because it might be trope, but people do judge books by their covers. So we treat aesthetics as politics in a sense. And I think like Walter Benjamin argued, as revolutionaries, we must politicize our aesthetics and not simply aestheticize our politics, which I think for Benjamin was the domain of fascists. So I think that our books look and feel beautiful because of, our view that, brilliant revolutionary content deserves brilliant revolutionary form. So who we aim to serve primarily organizers, activists, and people on the ground, but also scholars, students, artists, and other revolutionaries. organic intellectuals of the working class. And I think that some recent or exciting releases, we're here today to talk about this book, Jacques Pauwels' brilliant How Paris Made the Revolution and How the Revolution Made Paris. Very fitting the day after Bastille Day. So this is fantastic. It's wonderful to be here with you all. You can find us online, check out our social medias. We're at Iskra Books on most platforms, just at, and then Iskra Books. And then we also run the print journal Peace, Land, and Bread, which is kind of like our flagship publication. And you can find us there at PLB Magazine on most platforms. Also, our website is iskrabooks.org. Everything that you see here is free online. We also are on most platforms worldwide. We're through all the major booksellers. We're in small radical bookshops around the world. And if you are with an organization and would like, to get books at cost or at a, sort of discounted rate, please just email us. We're always there for you. We support this kind of work. So yeah, with all that said, I'm going to pass the mic over here to Donal, who is the managing editor of our very first imprint at Iskra Books, which is a solely Irish language imprint, Bradan Fasa. So please, Donal, take us away.
Míle maigat cáide agus a cumráide gur míle mágwibh as an deiste bheith live inniu a baris ag an Cairlan Teoric Criticula. So comrades and friends, thanks very much for this opportunity to be here talking to you today at the Critical Theory Workshop. My name is Donal Macon-Carrigan. I'm an associate editor with Iskra Books, but I'm also in charge of the Irish language imprint on Bradan Fasa. So the name of our imprint refers to an ancient Irish legend called the Salmon of Knowledge, which whoever ate the salmon would be afforded all of the knowledge of the world. So that's kind of our ethos in trying to spread the knowledge to the masses. Language, and particularly Indigenous and minority languages, are key to any struggle, and Ireland is no different. The revolutionary martyrs who struck a blow for Irish freedom during the 1916 Easter Rising, they all cut their teeth through Irish language activism with Cunra na Gaeilge or the Gaelic League. The men and women Republican prisoners of all stages of the conflict of the national liberation struggle endeavoured to learn the language while imprisoned by the occupiers, often under very brutal repressive conditions. And at present, the Irish language is going through a significant revival with the youth of the country embracing the language, partly in thanks to groups like NECAP and things like that. But the youth are turning against the narrative that this language is old and it's of the peasantry and there's no use to it. They're beginning to embrace it. It was a language which was robbed of them by colonialism, genocide, intergenerational shame and trauma. It's in this context that we formed Bradan Fasa, the only Irish language revolutionary publishing house in Ireland. We aim, as Iskra Books aims, as Ben said, to enable the learner and the working class to have affordable, easily accessible texts to enable real world change on the ground. And we've seen great success with our first title by Dr. Ciarán Ó Luain, which is Cá Idir an Pobal agus an Murder Machine, Glúiseacht na Gaelscoileachta ní ag seachtó trí go fiche trí, which is a history of the radical Irish school medium language school system. And the future of Ireland is Gaelic. We hope to play our part in the ongoing cultural revival and the rejection of foreign English-speaking dominance on our country. So, merci à tous, Chucky Arla.
Thanks so much, everyone, and thanks so much, everyone, and thanks to Critical Theory Workshop for inviting us and giving us this opportunity. So the rest of the session is to focus on this new book by Jacques Pauwels, How Paris Made the Revolution and the Revolution Made Paris. So just we're going to have a brief introduction, a little bit of housekeeping, then we'll have a section of the book read by Jacques, and then we'll have some questions that Talia and I will throw around, and then we'll have more time for your questions. So briefly, some introductions. My name's David Peets. I'm one of the editors of with Iskra Books, and I edited this one. And I also have...
Hi, I'm Celia. I'm an editor with Iskra Books, and I also work on the Bradan Fasa project.
And Jacques Pauwels, a brief introduction. Yeah, Jacques was born in Belgium, but currently lives in Canada, where he's taught European history at various universities. He's the author of many fantastic books on history, and they've been translated into many languages. For example, one known as the Great Class War, 1914 to 1918, and one Myths of Modern History, from the French Revolution to the 20th century World Wars and the Cold War, and also, of course, this new one. Just briefly to introduce the book. It's a fascinating book. I really recommend you take a look. You know, it's really fantastic for us to be here in Paris to do a launch. The book is about Paris, and it's about the relationship between the city of Paris and its revolutionary movements. It's a deeply materialist history. It's concerned with how architecture, the ways of life, the food culture, the kind of the third spaces such as taverns and restaurants, and how all of those have given rise to revolutionary movements, and how the movements themselves have impacted those forms, and that relationship going back and forth between those, between the culture and the political culture. You know, to be in Paris to discuss it, Paris has always been a revolutionary city, and it has a strong revolutionary history, and it also has been a city for revolutionaries. You know, Marx and Engels were here, spent some time here, and wrote extensively on the political movements of their time and were active participants in them. Marx had moved to London in 1848, but the Manifesto of the Communist Party was released in London just a few days after the 1848 revolution here in Paris. He also wrote about the communards in the Civil War in France. Also, you know, other revolutionaries in history have been very influenced by Paris and its culture and its movements. So Lenin, who, you know, he was said to have celebrated 72 days after the 1917 revolution because it had outlasted the Paris Commune. So he was said to have danced in the snow in celebration of this fact. And yeah, continuing into 20th century history, many revolutionaries have spent time in Paris and been impacted by it. Ho Chi Minh, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, they all spent time here, and you know, they learned Marxism here in various ways, and then they developed it in their own contexts. So Paris, yeah, has always been a revolutionary city, and this book really brings out how that character manifests in the physical form of the city. And yeah, it's a really insightful book, but also easy to read, engaging with lots of interesting stories and little kind of bits of history and anecdotes. And it's also a fantastic guidebook. So, you know, you are spending time in Paris, and this can tell you where to go and see some remnants of that revolutionary history. So yeah, you're already in here. So I would say take a look. As I mentioned, we'll have them on sale, but also we give away a free PDF of all of our text. So go on the website, you can get the PDF for free. Great. So Jacques, if you wouldn't mind, if you could start reading a section for us, a section from the conclusion, and anything else you would like to.
That's easy. I just have to read something. That's all. Well, I just want to add something to what you said. My book is about Paris and the French Revolution, but in a way, it's all about revolutions in general. And as you may know, the French Revolution ended or gave way to a series of wars, the Revolutionary Wars or the Napoleonic Wars. And that is not a coincidence. I explain in my book how revolutions tend to trigger wars, not in a simple one way, in a rather complex way, which I try to sort out. And conversely, then wars can then trigger revolutions. That dialectic is what I'm really interested in and that I'm really trying to explain. Of course, I use the French Revolution as the example, but I also then move on later on to explain how the French Revolution then basically led to wars, but then later on wars led to revolutions and so forth. And that actually then continues to the First World War. And my book of the Great Class War, 1914-18, is in a way the logical continuation of that. So I just want to warn you that, or that you know that it's not just a book about Paris. And if you're not interested in Paris, you shouldn't bother reading it. I think you should read it because it's about revolutions in general. And I think it's an analysis, as you mentioned, it's a materialist analysis that can help you also understand revolutions elsewhere and see also how the impact of revolutions. And in my book, then I deal with how Paris made a revolution. Actually, know how Paris made revolutions also then in 1830, 1848, and famously so in 1871, the Paris Commune, right? And but conversely, then the dialectic again, the revolutions remade Paris. And that actually, because the fact of making a revolution remade Paris also, and I'm trying to sort out, especially towards the end. And I'm going to read a little part from the end. And it also shows how history can be, and in my view should be, relevant for today. Too often we are told now by the media and by politicians and journalists, oh, history, that's old stuff. Don't bother learning that, and don't waste your time at university. Henry Ford famously said, history is bunk, don't waste your time with that. He was afraid you might learn how he became as rich as he did. But as Balzac said, behind every great fortune there hides a crime. So anyways, so in my last chapter then actually continue to explain a few things about the Eiffel Tower and about the Olympic Games last year in Paris. I won't get that far, but I'm going to read a bit of it. Okay, so here we go. So after the tragedy of the 1871 Paris Commune, France's age of revolutions was clearly over. This set the stage for the embourgeoisement, that's the French word for bourgeoisification, of Paris to be certified symbolically, which was done in 1889. In that year, the centenary of the outbreak of the Great Revolution, the urbanistic triumph of the bourgeoisie was proclaimed architecturally by the erection of the Eiffel Tower, an oversized kind of totem pole, conjuring up modernity, science and technology, and progress, values associated with the bourgeoisie tribe, the bourgeois tribe in France and elsewhere in general, and with France's bourgeois Third Republic, born 1870 in particular. The Republican pylon, as they called it, also functioned as a phallic symbol of the young, dynamic, and potent class the bourgeoisie perceived itself to be. Rising high above the Grenelle Plain, that's what the Champ de Mars there today, rising high above the Grenelle Plain and therefore visible far and wide, and conjuring up a lighthouse, radiating the bright light of modernity to the four corners of the land and indeed the world, the tower also had the merit, from the bourgeois point of view, of overshadowing and indeed humbling the very horizontal Pont Neuf, emblem of the former royal Paris. This bridge suspended just above the waters of the Seine, conjuring up the biblical waters of darkness and chaos before creation. As Eiffel's steel pillar similarly dwarfed and demoted the venerable architectural icon of the ecclesiastical face of the royal city of old, Notre Dame. It proclaimed the tower proclaimed the superiority of the new republican capitalist France of the bourgeoisie to the old monarchical feudal France dominated by the nobility and the church. Last but not least, the tower also usurped the Pont Neuf's reputation as hallmark of the French capital and effectively shifted the city's center of gravity from the Ile de la Cité, heart of central Paris, to the city's bourgeois western parts, antipodes of the plebeian eastern districts such as the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. That's beyond the Place de la Bastille. That's where the revolutionaries, that was the lion's den of the revolutionaries. It was probably also not a coincidence that the bourgeois Tower of Babel on the Seine was erected on a site with martial and Napoleonic overtones, namely the Champ de Mars, or Field of Mars, named after the god of war. This vast open space was formerly the training ground of the École militaire, where the young Napoleon had studied to become an officer, a building whose main facade looks out on the tower. The presence of Eiffel's pillar also conveniently obliterated the memories, many of them far from dear to bourgeois hearts, of popular demonstrations and riots that took place there at the time of the radical phase of the Great Revolution, especially the 1796 Grenelle massacre of the Babouvists, the proto-communists, you may call them. Arguably even more important by the tower's position was the vicinity to yet another Napoleonic lieu de mémoire, the Hôtel des Invalides, final resting place of the man who had been the godfather of bourgeois France while alive and the mascot of bourgeois Paris after his death. Mircea Eliade, the great Romanian specialist in ancient myths and religion, has argued that archaic people tended to be overwhelmed by the vast, seemingly chaotic, and in many ways mysterious and frightening world they inhabited, a world or universe of which they were only an infinitesimal, insignificant, and powerless part. they experienced the need to bring order and surveyability to this world. That is, to transform its chaos into a cosmos, a world that remained mysterious, but was at least to some extent familiar, understandable, and less fearsome. This task was typically accomplished by finding and marking a center that is a place with great meaning in space as well as of time, a sacred space. It was a geographic center of the world, in other words, a navel of the body of the earth, perceived as a human being, a mother, and was also the place where the world had been created by the gods. A very old and big tree in real or imaginary mountains, exemplified by the Mount Meru of Buddhism and Hinduism, and by the pyramids of Egypt, might function as such a sacred spot. Alternatively, a pillar or tower could be constructed and proclaimed to be the center of the center or navel of axis of the world and the locus of creation. Arguably, the most famous example of such an axis mundi was a ziggurat or step pyramid in the city of Babylon, the famous Tower of Babel. Towers symbolically functioned as a connection between earth and heaven. They enabled humans to ascend or at least approach the heavens, and conversely permitted the gods to descend on earth. Towers like the one in Babylon, known as Etimanki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, thus also marked a place sacred in time, because they were considered a site where the gods had come down for the purpose of creating human beings and their world. Towers of this kind were thus also viewed as ladders and featured steps representing rungs, as in the case of the Tower of Babel. The Eiffel Tower's construction, location, most striking features, and history until the present time may be interpreted with the help of these Eliadian insights. The revolutions that rocked France, and indeed the entire world, from 1789 to 1871, brought about the demise of the old cosmos of feudal and monarchical France, dominated by the duo of the nobility and the church. During nearly a century of chaos, a new cosmos was created in France, a capitalist rather than feudal order with a republic as a political exoskeleton, and dominated economically and socially by the haute bourgeoisie. Other countries would follow suit, but France was first to achieve a virtually perfect bourgeois status. It was the primordial bourgeois state. The French capital, where most of the crucial revolutionary events had taken place, thus revealed itself to be the epicenter of an emerging international capitalist and bourgeois universe. Consequently, it was only fitting that the bourgeois metropolis erected a monument to confirm and celebrate its lofty status, sacred respect to space as well as time. First, as epicenter of the new bourgeois and capitalist world, and second, as locus of the uneasy birth via revolutions of the new world, of this new world. The Eiffel Tower, then the highest building in the world, was that monument, that cosmic tree, but with its perpendicularity interrupted by 3 floors, it also conjured up a ladder, much as in the case of the Hanging Gardens of the Tower of Babel. It was also a step pyramid. The Eiffel Tower indeed proclaimed Paris to be the Babylon of the new bourgeois cosmos. That's enough.
Yeah.
At least no.
Thanks so much,
Yeah,
Jacques.
thank you.
Yeah, I hope that gives you a little taste of, how it can really enhance your understanding of just when you're moving around the city of Paris. There's so much history everywhere you look, and so much significance and symbolism. And yeah, that's brought out really well in the book. So we'll now have Talia and I will ask a few questions, and then we'll hand it over to you guys, if that's okay. So my first question. The epigraph of the book is by the Italian philosopher and historian Domenico Lacerdo. And it reads, if we want to understand the genesis of modern democracy and the problems that it poses, we need to turn back to the era of French Revolution. So yeah, how do you interpret the statements?
Well, first of all, I'm a great admirer of Domenico Lacerdo. I remember hearing about him first and eventually also meeting him and reading his books about 20 years ago. And I also had a chance to meet him personally a few times. And many of his books have been real eye-openers for me. And I would recommend them to all serious students of history and not only recent, but certainly modern history. And I was struck by his comment that we should really start the French Revolution. And in fact, most of my books about the 20th century, but I kept experiencing the need to go back to the French Revolution, to see where the idea of revolution comes from. And I also just mentioned earlier my views on the dialectic between revolutions and wars, which is what the last couple of 100 years have been all about. Revolutions and wars and revolutions. Revolutions that led to wars that triggered revolutions. So I felt really inspired by Domenico Losurdo. And when he says that, he then proclaims, so to speak, the French Revolution to be the beginning, the starting point of modern democracy, because as you may know, there's also been democracies in earlier times. Then that's a very important point. And we have to keep in mind then that before 1789, there was really no democracy at all. And here I want to just mention briefly that with Losurdo, I also agree that the American Revolution, which was anterior to the French Revolution, chronologically anterior, was not a real revolution. It was a rebellion. Okay, it was one elite basically replacing another elite. It was the transatlantic English elite that didn't like being basically lorded over by the British original London-based elite and wanted the total freedom to do what they wanted to do, not freedom as such, but freedom to, for example, to genocide the native population and freedom to keep the blacks enslaved. That was the freedom they wanted. Couldn't say that. It's for the glorified freedom as an abstract idea, which of course is useless. Nobody's against freedom. Nobody's against motherhood either. These are abstract ideas, but whose freedom are we talking about? The freedom to do what? The freedom for what and the freedom from what? These are very important questions we should ask. So the freedom that the fathers of independence in the United States wanted was actually the freedom to do as they pleased with their slaves and with their natives, which was mostly after massacring the one and lording it over the others and abusing the labor of the others. I'm sorry to say that, but I mean, that's just the way that it was. Certainly, Saussure saw it that way, and I must agree. So that the American Revolution was a rebellion, not a revolution. And in my preface of the book, my introduction, I tried to sort out these things, the revolution versus rebellion. What are the hallmarks of revolution? What makes people revolutionaries? And it's not such a thing as a revolutionary temper, as you sometimes hear, where some people or some cities or some countries seem to be more revolutionary because of that je ne sais quoi, which is, of course, an idealist kind of interpretation, that the ideas come from dropping out of the sky, and it's bullshit. It's the basis is material, right? The basis of some people became revolutionaries because the material conditions forced them to become revolutions. I mean, these women that played an important part in the revolution didn't come out for the pleasure of being revolutionaries. They were not sitting bitten by a mosquito and were infected by the revolutionary temper. Just recently read a book about that called The Revolutionary Temper. It's nonsense, right? It's nonsense. It was the high price of bread. The increasingly difficult circumstances of life for ordinary people that forced them to come out in the streets and demand that the government do something. And that, of course, is something that Marx analyzed. He said it's a pauperization that causes people to want and make a revolution, right? Anyways, so all this then is what I'm sure. I hope that my response is not too long. But Losurdo then says the first real revolution in the sense of a movement to improve the conditions of ordinary people, the demos, as in democracy. Democracy means power, kratos, for the demos. And the demos is not the whole people, das Volk, as the Nazis would say. No, it's the lower classes. It's ceux d'en bas, not ceux d'en haut. It's those below, not those above, right? It's ordinary people. It's the common people, le menu peuple, as they said, right? So these are the people for whom something needs to be done, and they'll do it themselves, right? And also they want some input in the business of government. That is a democracy, right? And that then, the movement towards democracy was started with the French Revolution, and it's continuing today. This democratization process is continuing today. And I have news for you. In spite of all the BS you hear about that we are and have achieved democracy, it's not true. It's just not true. With all due respect, while France, Britain, Belgium, where I'm from, Canada, where I live, are much more democratic than they were in the past, and much more democratic than many other countries that are much further away. We are still on our way to democracy. And to say that we are democracies, like as if we have arrived, is nonsense. Democracy is still a distant star, Iskra, I guess, that we are moving towards, right? And we have made that progress. We started to make that progress with the French Revolution. And we've made lots of steps forward since that time, and also quite a few steps backward. As we make our way up, some people are trying to push us back down. The First World War, as I interpret, the First World War is a great attempt to basically to undo the revolution, and to a great attempt for a big, sort of a retour en arrière, as they say in France, back to the past, back to the good old days before the revolution. Anyway, so that is how I interpret, that's why I mentioned in my preface, I mentioned that quotation by Lassalle.
Great.
It was as simple an answer as I could give.
Fantastic. And yeah, as you mentioned, in our countries, even in the imperial core, the illusion of democracy is increasingly fragile. And I'm from Britain, and we're seeing, even more reversions on the supposed freedoms that were guaranteed, like freedom of speech. Anything around Palestine is increasingly repressed, and people are being arrested. Weekly, there's demonstrations where people are just saying, I don't support genocide, basically, and then they're being arrested for it. And just to say, as publishers, obviously, we're very sensitive to this kind of thing.
In my book on the great myths of history, I come up with a term that to illustrate what I'm saying. We have systems that look like democracy. There's tidbits that conjure up democracy. And that's what has convinced a lot of people we have democracy. What we have is the style, but not the substance. It's all show. It's smoke and mirrors. It's not a real thing. So the term I came up with is pseudomocracy. It looks a bit like democracy, smells a bit of democracy at times, but it's not the real thing. But it's better than before the French Revolution. Every revolution brought improvements. And may I just say that because some people think that revolutions are sort of nasty business, and that's what you've been told. That's what I learned, that revolution was really nasty stuff, with bloodthirsty people chopping off heads, and oh my God, thank God it was all over afterwards, and thank God Napoleon came in and restored order, the nightmare was over. The French Revolution brought some major improvements. And amazingly, but actually not amazingly, they are not very often mentioned, because they were achieved by the most despised revolutionary named Robespierre, the most radical of revolutionaries, right? And actually, we hear instead a lot of praise and lots of statues and places named after the guy who actually undid some of the achievements of Robespierre, namely Napoleon. Let me give you an example, the best example I can think of. Whenever somebody asks me what was the most democratic achievement of the French Revolution, it happened at its most radical stage of the French Revolution. It was something that most Frenchmen don't even know that, I think. It seems that way. I mean, I don't know. I come to France often and talk to them, and they don't seem to know that. Under Robespierre in 1794, France was the first country in the world to abolish slavery. Well, that's a huge achievement, because if there is a quintessentially anti-democratic institution, is the idea that you can consider other people as your property, that people can be treated as property of somebody else, basically, and have to work as slaves for their whole life, and be born a slave and die a slave. I mean, and that's an institution that's thousands of years old, and it was spread all over the world. And actually, no government and no Catholic Church, no religion, essentially try to undo that, But the French revolutionaries did. Wow! For that alone, Robespierre should have a statue in the middle of Place de la Concorde, right? But no, nothing. Not even a square named after him, right? And instead, all the squares and the monuments are for Napoleon. And he actually, when he came to power, brought slavery back. What a crime, right? And then started wars that cost the lives of millions of people. But he's the big hero. Go figure, right? I mean, that's how poor history can be, or the presentation can be. So I'm just saying that revolutions cause progress in the direction of democracy. They don't achieve the democratic utopia, that's for sure. There's still always a long way to go. And by the way, Napoleon brought slavery back, and how was it then finally abolished? In the 1848 revolution again. So once again, a revolution that may change. Women weren't beneficiaries of any revolution of the French revolutions, but they were beneficiaries of the Russian Revolution, weren't they? Right? So these are things that we have to keep in mind. That the revolutions are good for ordinary people. Now, our media, our powers that be, our educational system wants you to think of revolutions as bad, and therefore revolution is bad. That's what the message you get. But somehow they give it away that actually they know, or you should know, that revolutions are good for you. Because when I watch a commercial and there's a new detergent in the market, it's praised as revolutionary. It's a revolutionary new product. No new product, no new Coca-Cola, whatever, is ever mentioned as it's a great counter-revolutionary product. No, they say it's revolutionary, right? So that means that you must think of it in positive terms. You want to buy it. If it's revolutionary, I want it. So if it's revolutionary, guys, go for it. Okay.
Right. Talia?
Thank you. So I think a lot about language, and it's briefly mentioned in this book, like it's a footnote, and I apologize for this.
I apologize.
So it was mentioned that French was the language of the revolution, and one revolutionary said that they should eradicate the dialects. And in 1794, a propaganda minister said that federalism and superstition speaks Low Breton, and fanaticism speaks Basque. And there are many dialects and languages like the Breton language in France. And I think with this chauvinism on display, would you take that as one of the reasons the revolution failed outside of Paris? And even now within the imperial core, there seems to be a lack of understanding or respect about indigenous or minority languages. And how do we combat this within our own organizations? Sorry.
Yeah. Well, languages and dialects, of course, are the same thing in many ways. And you may have heard of that famous definition of a language or a dialect, or the difference. Have you ever heard that joke? Yeah. That's a language or a dialect is a language without an army. Right? If an army is a dialect, a language is a dialect with an army, right? I mean, the history of the French language is interesting, because what the French speak is the language of the Paris area, Langue d'Oil. But in the south, they spoke an Occitanian language, like the Provençal or the Languedocian language, the Languedoc, the language of yes. And that Languedoc was actually suppressed in the context of a crusade preached or wanted by the Pope to wipe out heresies in the south in that area, which the Pope, the kings of France of the north gladly did, because it allowed them to expand their territory. They sent their armies down and they took over the south and imposed their language, the northern language, the language of Oil, the language where oui was Oil, which yes was Oil, oui, as opposed to the language where yes was Oc. And since that time, in Toulouse and Marseille, they've been forced to speak Northern French, and they know it. And they're still today, actually, I'm happy to see that in the south of France, they still now have bilingual signs again, where the language of Oil, the Languedocian language, the Occitanian language is making a comeback. But you could say that even that the language, the French language, became the language of the country because of the power behind it, right? And the resistance, and again, sometimes was necessarily against whatever came from Paris, whether that was revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. So language itself, basically, is not per se, is not intrinsically revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, progressive or regressive or conservative. It depends on the circumstances. And I'm thinking of many countries where they had a foreign language shoved down their throat, where the language then was used for good purposes and was in a revolutionary context. Catalan language, for example, which I remember being repressed under Franco, and Irish being the famous example of that. Of course, I don't have to tell you guys that. And Flemish, where I'm from, I'm Flemish. It was different because under France, of course, Flemish was repressed also. But then what you had is that the Catholic Church, which controlled much of Flanders, as it did Quebec and so on, they of course were against anything that came down the pipe from France, especially when the revolutionary government became anti-clerical for reasons which I described in my book. Then the Catholic Church and the counter-revolution in general, promoted the use of Flemish because it helped the anti-French cause, the counter-revolutionary cause. And there's still a bit of that in Flanders today, where today in Belgium, unfortunately, the biggest parties in Flanders are very right-wing conservative parties that believe this kind of nonsense about that we are the people and the language and all that, and so that then overrules the idea, the class contradictions, obfuscates that, right? And people forget about that. Oddly enough, some Flemish nationalists in Belgium, are voting for parties that are totally against their own interests. Essentially, it's a false consciousness. So languages can be used, can find themselves in the revolutionary camp, but also in the counter-revolutionary one.
Great. Yes, so I had a question, seeing as we're here right now, about contemporary Paris, and around the world, Paris and its political culture is known as being very vibrant and very energetic, shall we say, demonstrations. But Paris under Mayor Anne Hidalgo has undergone quite a few changes in terms of traffic and so on in the center of the city. Do you interpret these as having an impact on the political culture of the city? And just if you could also touch on the Olympics.
Well, in my book, towards the end, I describe how the bourgeois whole of Paris, you might say that the bourgeoisie conquered Paris as a result of the revolutions. The revolutions were mostly the work of the ordinary people, but the bourgeoisie was the main beneficiary. The bourgeoisie at one point tried to plebeize Paris, but that didn't work out, and Paris was bourgeoisified. The embourgeoisement went out and was basically certified with the erection of that phallic symbol, the Eiffel Tower, right? But and that Eiffel Tower is supposed to proclaim once and for all that Paris is bourgeois, especially the western part. And but it's not so. That's been challenged a few times. I could have read more about the challenges. Challenges did not come, for example, under the German occupation, because Hitler was himself a very, very bourgeois. He was a petty bourgeois who was co-opted by the upper bourgeoisie of Germany and did their thing. And he admired Paris. He came here to actually, at one point after his victory in 1940 over France, to admire Paris. But he wanted Berlin to replace Paris as an even greater Babylon for his class, for the bourgeoisie, essentially, right? So that was not an issue. The German occupation never threatened bourgeois dominance over Paris. In fact, the bourgeoisie benefited big time from German occupation, as Annie Lacouaris has demonstrated very clearly in her books about France. So what happened is then that it was afterwards, when the resistance tried to come to power, before the American tanks came rolling in from Normandy, and British tanks and Canadian tanks, right? And that was actually when the bourgeoisie was fearing that, oh my God, if the Americans don't arrive quickly, then maybe there may be a fait accompli, as the French say, and we may have a socialist, God forbid, or communist government here, and that's the end of the world, right? And that was a threat. But then that was prevented. The Americans and British brought Charles de Gaulle in and presented him as the savior of the country, and he, of course, was very much a bourgeois president. But what I want to say is that ever since that time, there have been more challenges to bourgeois dominance of Paris. May 68 comes to mind. And as in any case, when the elites realize that the poor folks are restless, the masses are restless, you can use repression, which they do generously, but you can also use the carrot and the stick, and also, above all, symbolic concessions. That works so well, symbolic concessions. Like when that so-called socialist president came to power here in France in 1984, I think, Mitterrand, a very bourgeois gentleman. But he was supposed to be a socialist. Well, he didn't really do anything for the ordinary people, but he actually planted a few projects in Eastern and more proletarian, more plebeian, Eastern Paris, to make it more beautiful. Like, for example, the new opera at La Bastille, Well, that was great, isn't it? Well, I mean, an opera ticket there now is just as expensive as it was before, and it's sure there's nice yuppified little bars now and so on, and now the bourgeoisie even goes to Eastern Paris to have a drink once in a while. I mean, I walked to the Place La Bastille deliberately yesterday, and I paid €6 for a Perrier. Just, it's not as if the working class is really benefiting that much from it, but these were big gestures, And then, of course, implanting I'm staying at Bercy, forcing the Ministry of Finance to move to the Bercy working class neighborhood. Wasn't that something, huh? They were, of course, very unhappy, these great fonctionnaires having to move to Bercy, but wasn't that a major concession to the working class? Symbolic shit, right? I mean, really of no significance. And that's what we're talking about when I don't know exactly what Madame Hidalgo has been doing in Paris. I haven't been coming to Paris enough recently, but I imagine a lot of these things now making Paris green, you know what I mean? I can just see how that usually is meant to be to appease the restless folks down below,
Yeah.
The idea is always that to solve problems that aren't really the big problem, to stay away from the big problem, which of course is class relations in the end.
Yeah.
And that you don't touch.
And could you just touch on the Olympics and your?
Yes, well, that's in the book.
Yeah.
Yes, the Olympic Games that last year were obviously fit in that context, but the Olympic Games show and illustrate clearly what what I just said about the bourgeoisification, the embourgeoisement of Paris. But Paris is much more bourgeois in the West, in the center. That's the Paris of luxury, right? The eastern part is still much more down to earth, much more plebeic, basically, And then in last year during the Olympics, everything was in the West, right? Everything was in the West. I mean, in the boats that took the athletes, they actually sailed from the Pont d'Austerlitz, which is pretty well the cusp. That's where poor Paris starts. And right away, it showed their rear end to to Eastern Paris, and sailed bravely or happily to Western Paris. And arrived, we're at the Eiffel Tower, and there it was all this. That's where national singer there, what's her name? Would sing a song from the Eiffel Tower. That's where the tennis the games were played. That's where a lot of these races ended, in Western Paris, in bourgeois Paris. And that was also the idea to make a lot of money and to actually give Paris once again a moment of glory. You reaffirm the status of Paris, greatly diminished since the Second World War, as bourgeois Babylon, because with the defeat of France in 1940, and Paris lost its glamour and lost out in many ways to New York, as you may know, or as capital of the arts in the world. Everything shifted to New York, and now most people would, if asked, which is the city that oozes capitalism, that radiates capitalism, that speaks of capitalism, that yells of capitalism, it'd be New York, no longer Paris. But Paris is still in Europe pretty good, not like in the pre-World War II days when bourgeoisie from everywhere came to Paris, right? Now they're going to New York. But for a moment last year with the Olympics, Paris was once again the center of the capitalist cosmos or universe,
Okay, great. And Leah, maybe you can be the last one.
Sounds good. So I know I had a question about food, but I think since you've mentioned women, so we see women leading the charge in a lot of revolutions and rebellions throughout world history. And most famously, the March on Versailles was led by women, but not just for women, it was a cross-class of women. Do you think we will see this type of cross-class collaboration soon with the cost of living and housing crises?
Well, the women were indeed very major participants in the revolutionary movement of 1789 and the years following that. And the reason for that is that actually women, the lower class in general, was exploited and abused big time, but women in a double way. Because, of course, the old system was also a patriarchal system. And even the revolutionaries inherited the patriarchal mindset. There's no doubt about it. That's why, for example, when even Robespierre, the most radical of the revolutionaries, when he brought in a new constitution and brought in even universal suffrage, universal male suffrage. And the idea that women could vote even to him, now mind you, was petit bourgeois, but he could not unthink that. So women were continued to be victimized by the patriarchal attitudes that were so ingrained and that would take many, many years still to get rid of. And women also then suffered even more, definitely more than men, from the problems like the high price of bread and the high price of food in general, because not only because they didn't have bread, but they had to look after the children. And they couldn't feed the children properly, which of course is a very traumatic thing. So for women, you might say the problems that triggered the revolution were bigger than for men, and that plays a role. And another factor, another reason why the women were so visible in many revolutionary movements, because there was many of them. It wasn't just the storming of the Bastille. Even years later, there was revolutionary journées, as they called it, days when there was, people were out in the streets and there was fighting and demonstrations. And women were active. Is that one way that the counter-revolutionaries, or the revolutionaries who want to stop the revolution in its tracks at a certain point when it suited the bourgeoisie, but not go further, as the revolution threatened to do under Robespierre, under the Jacobins, they wanted to stop it right there, right? And at that stage, one solution was warfare, because warfare allowed them to take those restless sans-culottes and stuff them in the uniform and march a month and fight an external conflict as opposed to domestic conflict. And that's a great way, a very effective way of basically stopping domestic conflict by creating external conflicts. Even now, I can hear basically the calls for war all over the place here in France and elsewhere, also in Canada. We need to have more weapons and all that stuff, because it's a big, big problem. It's going to be a big war, meaning you guys shut up, be quiet. And to defend ourselves is going to be very costly. That's going to mean cuts in social services and stuff like that. So wars were a great way to stop revolutions that were aimed to achieve benefits for the lower classes, for the ordinary people. And war is a great way to prevent that from happening. And to come back now to the point, so all these young men were stuffed in uniforms and marched off to places as far away as Moscow, not to come back with the tens of thousands. So when there was revolutionary movements in the late 1790s, there were no more men. Basically, the women had to do it all now. The men were gone. The revolutionary men who would have been out there. There was only very few left. Right? So women had to do it. And in the last revolutionary, basically uprisings, women were the majority. But I just said about patriarchal attitude surviving even in the revolution. It's the march to Versailles of the women to bring the king back, the baker as they call him, because he was going to arrange for cheaper bread. It included women with hats. And these were actually, I should say upper class, but bourgeois women, who also under the gun and also disliked of course, were unhappy with the patriarchal attitudes that survived into the revolution. And Olympe de Gouges was, of course, one of the early pioneers in the feminist movement. But I don't know, was there a question about today in that respect?
Yeah.
There I couldn't really say much because I'm not really very well informed about the situation in France.
It's just like, well, I'm sure in France, but elsewhere, the cost of living is insane and rental prices are
That's right.
insane. We can't have kids. We can't really have a life.
Yes. Well, what I would say that I see that in Canada too. I mean, most women now have to work. And when I came to Canada 50 years ago, a working class person in the town where I lived, it was a big factory called Massey Ferguson, and it employed 8,000 people. And I used to play soccer with these guys, who were mostly Italians and so on, who had just arrived in Canada. And they would get a job at Massey Ferguson, and it was all unionized. They made good money, and they lived in a house of their own, and they could buy a house. And the wife would be home cooking pizza, cooking spaghetti or whatever, Now the idea of a guy working in a factory and making enough money and his wife not having to give a paid job. I'm not saying not working, she was working at home. But you know what I'm saying? That's totally out of the question, totally, absolutely impossible. So now women really definitely have to also bring in a wage, money, and then still, most cases, still do most of the work, Of course, they get sick and tired of that, so the pizza comes in every second day, and the hamburgers, which then leads to problems that we all know. So yeah, it's a tough life for women, because the expectation is still, of course, that women will still do the cooking when they come home. The husband and wife both come home late from work, but they still want to, the men usually still expect women to do the work. But I want to just say one thing. When I came to Canada 50 years ago, I bought a house, my wife and I, we bought a house for the price was about twice what I made, the salary I made in a year, okay? I can't tell you what it was. It was actually, it was about that, because I made in those days about 20,000 Canadian dollars, which was well paid, in Canada, Canadian dollars, right? And we paid $23,000 for the house, all right? And that was possible, right? It wasn't a fancy house, but it was a nice house. Today, the guy that made $20,000 then probably makes $100,000 now. That same house that I bought for $23,000 is now $890,000, So try to buy that house. I was shocked then that my monthly mortgage payment was going to be $200 a month. I said, oh my God, $200 a month, for 20 years, right? Now for $200, I can take my family to McDonald's anymore, So it's true that the pressure is on. And again, women, of course, always double pressure. But you want to talk about food?
Do you want to talk about that?
No, but you said you were going to talk about food.
Well,
but we talked about hamburgers just now, right?
yeah, well, we have we're going to take questions from the audience and all of that. So if someone has question about food.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jacques,
Yeah.
for the responses to our questions. And yeah, so we're going to open it up. We're going to have about 40 minutes
right.
for questions from you guys. So have you been doing it individually or taking three at once?
We have the talking stick and Seema's going to animate the talking stick.
Okay.
Jacques, it's your call, but what we've been doing is grouping together about 3 to 4 questions so we get as many people in and having the speaker note them down.
Okay, yeah, okay.
If you're amenable
Yeah.
to that, or we can do them
No,
one
no,
at a
that's
time.
fine.
That works?
I'm flexible.
Okay. Show is yours. Yeah.
I'm wondering what you see as your book and your work's place in a larger historiographical project of Paris and the French Revolutions, insofar as there seems to be well, I won't say there seems to be, there is a trend well established and kind of an imperative to traffic ideas of revolution and current revolutionary movements through Paris's history and through France's history. And there's sort of this transit from everywhere else in the world through Paris in order to understand revolution. And what do you think the implications are of that, especially for, I mean, in a very obvious example, like for somewhere like Vietnam, how do they reckon with the fact that there's this historiographical impulse to understand France in order to understand themselves in a revolutionary sense? And yeah, where do you see your work's kind of place in that sort of long history of theoretical and historical work, as well as like the larger landscape of that fact?
Good.
Hi. Sure. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. On the questions of historiography, I mean, as a historian of the French Revolution, I guess I wanted to know your kind of opinion or stance on. There seems to be with the French Revolution a historiographic distinction made. I would say it's a mistake. I think many people do between what people see as the French Revolution proper and what is called the terrors. I think there's like a lot of just in terms of like the canonization of the French Revolution. I went to the concierge recently. It made it so obvious. It said one revolution, the French Revolution, the second revolution, the terrors. I think there's like a lot of work going on right now to correct that kind of discussion. So I want to know where you see it, if there is a distinction, if it's useful, if it's bogus.
Yeah. May I ask those 2 questions? They seem to be related to me. Is that okay? Yeah. Yes, I like, because otherwise it gets a bit too complicated if I get a 3rd question thrown in. But to the first question, I would answer. I did answer the question in a way by saying at the beginning already that while my book is about Paris, it's about revolutions, plural, then and now. Okay, so indeed, Paris, the French Revolution, was the mother of all revolutions, so to speak. As Losurdo said, I think I mentioned that in the context of my response to why I cite Losurdo. Indeed, and we know that, for example, the Russian revolutionaries, Lenin found much inspiration in the American Revolution. In the French Revolution, and in the Paris Commune, which was the 4th one of the series of revolutions that I describe in my book. So yes, the Marseillaise was sung by the Bolsheviks. So there's always the model, the example, because the French Revolution was a revolution that did succeed. Didn't bring democratic perfection in the world, that's for sure, but it did achieve some wonderful things. Like, for example, I mentioned the abolition of slavery, right? And that, which somehow they don't want you to know now, right? They don't want you to know now, but a lot of people did make a note of that and did know it, and did know that for ordinary people, the lives of ordinary people improved quite a bit because of the revolution. So the revolution was basically a good example, you might say, for revolutionaries who have similar problems, because the problems are similar. And indeed, the kinds of class relations that depend on the result of the economic developments, in Europe that led to the French Revolution. This whole system has basically spread all over the world with imperialism, right? So in a sense, the system that produced a reaction in the form of the French Revolution continued to expand and grow, not only in France and Europe, but all over the world, triggering similar reactions elsewhere. That is actually the lesson. That's why Mao and Zhou Enlai and Ho Chi Minh, they learned, as was mentioned here already, in France, they learned about the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. Okay, that was also, of course, a source of inspiration. Revolutionaries basically learned from previous revolutionaries. You know, they learned lessons, right? And of course, they also like to learn from mistakes, of course, right? So yeah, that's extremely important. But now to come back to the second question, there are indeed, the French Revolution is not monolithic. There was no one French Revolution. Obviously, I don't mean there was not only the one of 1789 and following years, plus 1830, 1848, and 1871. No, already 1789, 1799, that's two revolutions packed in one. Okay? And that's one associated with the terror and the other one presumably not. That is a kind of historiographic view that actually is, I would say, is almost like the dominant view right now. That's the one that I would want you to believe. The idea that the French Revolution at first was good and then became bad. You know, there were good guys who improved certain things, and then suddenly bad guys took over, and whoa, thank God we stopped them. You know, so essentially, there's the revolution. I call in my book 1789 and 1792. And what happened is that the first revolution then was basically a revolution in which the bourgeoisie participated eagerly with the working class, the ordinary people. Not because they were hungry, they were not. Not because they were poor, they were not. But they had no political power, and they disliked all the economic policies of the government that didn't facilitate their interests. They knew that the monarchical government was a state, the monarchical state was a state at the service of the feudal interests, of the agrarian interests, you might say, of landed interests, you know, of the owners of land, the church and the nobility. And they wanted a state at the service of their interests, mercantile interests, financial interests, business interests, industrial interests, right? And they achieved that. They hoped to achieve that more or less the way that it was achieved elsewhere in other countries like Britain and Belgium and Holland. A constitutional monarchy would have been fine, you know, with a parliament where we control who's in the parliament, right? Meaning by means of, for example, of no universal suffrage, no, because then the masses come in, no, with censitary suffrage, where you have to pay taxes a certain amount to be able to go to parliament. And that way, the bourgeoisie is quite happy, because in spite of their numerical inferiority, you know, they can dominate the parliament, and in the constitutional monarchy, they dominate the executive, right? So they wanted to get away from the absolute monarchy, right? And that's achieved by 1790. It's a done deal, right? And they're happy. They can stop the revolution. They can all go home now. It's all over. We're happy. But the ordinary yokels, the ordinary people weren't happy. They kept whining about bread prices and all that stuff. And oh my God, they can't just go home. That was the attitude of the bourgeoisie, you know. Don't they understand that it's finished, you know? But people weren't happy because the bread price kept going up. You know, there was misery in the land still. They wanted a resolution to that problem. And that would have meant, for example, intervening in the economy with putting on maximum prices, the law of the maximum, as they called it, right? Well, the bourgeoisie didn't want that. And by the way, the idea that of abolishing slavery, that was very much against the French bourgeoisie, because the leading element of the French bourgeoisie at the time, the most powerful, the wealthiest burghers, you know, business people of France were not Parisians. They came from Bordeaux and Nantes. They were the so-called Girondins. And they were wealthy people. I was just in Bordeaux. The wealth still radiates from the city, the facades. And they made money in trade and merchant. Trade in what? Wine, of course, is what they tell you right now. And it's true. There was a lot of money coming in for wine. But slavery, the slave trade was, wow, that was a wonderful source of income, of capital accumulation. And slaves, well, of course, you could not sell slaves if you abolished slavery. I mean, they were totally against that. They thought slaves were a proper form of property. You know, you cannot touch that. Well, the revolutionaries, the radicals, wanted to touch on that. They abolished it. Well, that was going too far. That's why they were eliminated. That's why Robespierre was eliminated. And now we have actually a big effort to stop the revolution in its tracks, right? So what you have is historians like Furet and so on, already in 20, 30 years ago, describing the revolution was fine at first. Because bourgeois historians now say it was fine, and oh my God, and comes these guys like, oh, and they use that terror. That's awful. I mean, they don't mind that a bit of blood flows, as long as it's the blood that flows on their behalf. And the terror, is now represented by these historians as oh my God, that is really so bad. What they forget is what Mark Twain famously said, that the terror of the French Revolution, first of all, it was not innocent people who fell victim, but that terror was nothing compared to the built-in terror of the system, okay? There was the terror hardwired in the Ancien Regime system was far worse than anything that. There was the burning at the stakes, the drawing and quartering of people, the hangings, witchcraft, the burning of witches, the St. Bartholomew's night. I mean, massacres galore, bloodshed galore. And then Napoleon comes around. And how about the Napoleonic terror? Because in the terror itself, orchestrated admittedly, by the French revolutionaries, there was some thousands of victims. But how many victims were due to Napoleon's ambitions of making France the dominant country and him the big warlord? Millions of people. That was Napoleonic terror. But you don't talk about that. And not only that, but even before Napoleon, there was the white terror, as opposed to the red terror of the revolution. The terror, a counter-revolutionary terror. The guillotine stood in the middle of the square, in the middle of the city, in the middle of the country. And TV was there, if you know what I mean. There were spectators there. But the white terror happened in the countryside, where priests and noblemen were still in control. And they massacred revolutionaries by the thousands. But television wasn't there. The reporters weren't there. And many of our historians don't want to talk about it, because they prefer that you pay your attention to the visible terror, the one that they can then use to condemn the terrible excesses of the revolution, such as abolition of slavery. So there was two revolutions, essentially, right?
Sorry, I just want to, for 1 second, push back on your answer to my question.
Yes.
Because obviously the ironies of the French Revolution and its supposed successes is that while they abolished slavery, however shortly, the ravages of colonialism persisted for over 100 more years in the French Empire, and the freedom that was supposedly conferred and like this revolutionary impulse that supposedly made people more liberated in France was never granted to those in the colonies, right? And yet we still implicitly in our historiography expect colonized peoples to understand the French Revolution as the example par excellence of how to understand revolution, right? When those are the very people upon who the French Revolution's successes were predicated.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you
Yeah.
could speak a little bit more to that.
Well, I don't see the contradiction. What I said about the French Revolution is that it pushed the cause of democratization forward. It made gains, but these gains were rolled back afterwards, right? Under Napoleon, all these gains were rolled back. Similarly, then, 1848, with, for example, the final abolition of slavery, there was again made progress, but that revolution was also basically wiped out, repressed. And again, a lot of these advances were undone, were rolled back. And then later on, after the final of these, the last one, these four revolutions, the Paris Commune, basically the reaction then again undid a lot of the advantages achieved on behalf of democracy. And that is when then imperialism starts booming big time. France had always been a colonial power, right? And the revolutionaries, the real revolutionaries, the radical revolutionaries had done something against that. They had the example being the abolition of slavery, which is a big thing. But after 1871, the bourgeoisie is now firmly in the saddle, and then colonialism becomes a big thing that they want. They pursue big time. And France conquers Algeria, and France colonizes Morocco and colonizes Vietnam and all that stuff. There's no way we can blame sort of the revolutionaries for the colonial expansion and the abuses of French colonialism later on. That you must understand. There's no direct link. There's no way that we can blame a guy like Robespierre. Robespierre also you cannot blame for the Napoleonic Wars, for example, warfare. Now, Robespierre famously said, "We don't want foreign wars because we want to concentrate on our domestic enemies. We want to basically, revolutionize the revolution, intensify the revolution in our own country, and we know that we wouldn't be welcome in other countries." But the counter-revolution, well, not a counter-revolution, but his opponents who wanted to stop the revolution after the bourgeoisie had made its gains, then they preferred war as a way to basically prevent the revolution from continuing. So I don't see that there's a contradiction there. The revolution was essentially the first time that an attempt to basically undermine colonialism, by basically abolishing the institution upon which it was based, which was slavery.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I'm interested in your discussion of the dialectics between war and revolution.
Could you speak a little louder, please?
I'm interested in your discussion of the dialectics between war and revolution.
Yes.
And I'm specifically wondering whether you have any thinking on the work of mourning within that. Collective grief and mourning is, I think, a well-established motif in terms of the ignition of resistance. I'm thinking here of things such as...
Could you microphone for the mouse? Okay, I can hear you.
Come here.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard.
No, go for it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Okay. So, as I said, I'm interested in your discussion of the dialectics between war and
Yes.
revolution. And I'm thinking here specifically of the working of mourning and collective grief in terms of sort of this relation between war and revolution. Thinking here specifically of things such as, Antigone, Fanon, or, most recently, like Fred Moten's argument on the Emmett Till photograph and the function of grief.
Sorry, I can't follow you. I can't follow you. What
yeah,
you're saying with morning, I can't follow.
Okay.
So can you speak slowly and clearly, because it's very, very difficult for me to understand.
Okay. So I'm wondering what the relation of collective grief and mourning is in the relation between war and revolution.
Yeah.
So specifically, whether revolutionary movements that lack a well-articulated radical vision that can turn the revolutionary momentum into a state-building project, is this loss metabolized in the form of warmongering? I'm thinking here beyond the example of the French context, examples such as that of the Greek Revolution, where the Greek Revolution of 1821 is followed by the civil wars of 1823, that were sort of described by an uncharacteristic bloodlust that I think has a sort of psychoanalytic function in this way.
Well, again, I'm not really.
Take more than one.
It's
Group a few together.
it's going to be difficult because it's pretty common. But of course, sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Give a short reply and then go on to the next one. Is that better?
Yeah, well, I'm still not clear to me how the question relates to the dialectic of war and revolution. Things like mourning and so on, it's not something that I've gone into. And so I really don't feel competent to answer a question like that because it's not something that I've wrapped my mind around. I mean, the revolution and the wars are complex enough as it is that you can't handle it all. So these things, like I know there's interesting books about that, and it deals with social psychology and things like that. But I try to stick as much as possible to the basics of the economics and social relations and so on. So I'm afraid I'm not a good guy to answer that question. I'm sorry. And again, I know about the Greek War of Independence and things like that, but I don't know about what you said was the follow-up conflicts and so forth. So I'm afraid I must plead incompetence here. That's a good answer, isn't it?
Can you turn on the mic as well? Just press down, hold it down until the red zone.
So my question is related to the first question, but sparked off by David's remarks introducing you, mentioning that various foreign revolutionary leaders came to Paris and became Marxists here. So I've been quite interested lately in early Chinese Marxism at the moment they were actually becoming Marxists, say like in the late 19-teens and the early 1920s, say between the October Revolution and the formation of the Comintern. And there seemed to be this debate in the New Culture movement between liberalism, anarchism, and Marxism. And they seem to see Paris as a center for world anarchism. And so, you know, they were scrambling around. There was some kind of sponsorship coming from Paris, and they were scrambling around getting the money to transport them. And Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, the sons of Chen Duxiu were all caught up in this. Mao Zedong, at the very last moment, getting on the boat, changed his mind and decided to stay in China. But Zhou Enlai came, and Chen Duxiu, who was soon to become the first general secretary of the Communist Party, said to his sons, who are anarchists, you know, please, I don't want to be on the other side of the barricades from you. Please consider Marxism. And they became Marxists here. And one of his sons actually is the first to translate the Internationale into Chinese. And Zhou Enlai, of course, you know, became a Marxist here. So I'm wondering if you can shed light on the atmosphere in Paris then, you know, that they were exposed to both, you know, both ideas in these debates, but what was it that really, the atmosphere here in Paris that, you know, tipped them over? And you know, how did they become Marxists here in Paris?
Well, can I answer that question? I'm not an expert on the history of Paris, you know. I'm not even an expert in French history or in the French Revolution. I'm just actually a generalist. So I know about anarchism, and I can answer that question. But if you ask me now, name an anarchist in Paris in 1919, I'm sorry, I couldn't do it. But I know Bakunin and Kropotkin and guys like that. And here I would want to say something that may be of interest to you. Anarchism was big in the late 1800s, as you know. I mean, famously, Marx and Bakunin didn't get along. And of course, most of the socialist parties set up followed Marx, adopted Marxian revolutionary socialism, with the state playing a role in it, and others went, you know, with Bakunin. And of course, much of anarchism, what made anarchism famous or infamous, was the assassination attempts. The idea that you could basically knock off a few guys, and that would then maybe trigger a revolution or bring about change. And they did knock off quite a few people. And you know, we all can think of some examples. I always think of Sisi, you know, Empress Sisi. Anyways, but obviously that didn't really do much. But the Russian Revolution certainly did, didn't it? And it seems to me that anarchism, the reason why anarchism then basically, I shouldn't say evaporated, certainly not, you know, but basically became far less attractive and found far fewer followers when the Russian Revolution at least achieved something, right? And set up a state, you know, with a government and an army that you needed to defend the revolution, right? And a lot of people must have realized at that time that basically anarchism, basically not believing in an organized state, somehow isn't going to work in the context of the 20th century, when, for example, the First World War had demonstrated all too clearly, you know, written in blood on the walls, you know, the importance of organization and the states, and how an individual massacring, killing somebody, that's just not going to do it. So I think that's the context in which probably these pretty smart Chinese fellows that came to, not Paris, but most of them to France, well, some of them Paris too, I guess, learned about the Russian Revolution and eagerly read Marx, but also Lenin. And I believe start to realize also that anarchism didn't have much of a future in China, that a strong state would have to be set up. And that's exactly what they've done in China, isn't it, if you think about it? So that's my answer.
Hi. So I'm thinking about your comments about the American Revolution as a rebellion and not a revolution, and I'm in agreement with you there. And so I'm kind of wondering your thoughts specifically on partly like, is democracy something that we think has an end, and then eventually like striving towards these sorts of revolutionary acts, like actual revolutionary acts, as you're comparing the Paris Revolution or French Revolution, I should say, sorry, to, is this something that we will maybe one day hopefully achieve like as a society or as like a global ideal? And I'm thinking too, if you have any comments about like the current state, I mean, I know you're not like specializing, or we're not talking necessarily about like the American context, but I'm thinking of like a lot of the ICE protests that are happening in like LA right now. And we have like a very tension, like there's a tension of like revolution in the air there. And if you have any comments on like ways that this could be used to help bring some of this back home to get the right sort of like revolutionary spirit going.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of revolutions, one thing, protest movements, demonstrations. You know, people demonstrating their unhappiness with the system is something else. So when do these movements congeal, and lead to an actual revolution? That is extremely hard to say. In fact, the American Revolution, while not a revolution, had some ingredients of a revolution in it. I must say that I was recently impressed by reading a book, I wish I could remember the title, and it deals with the the unrest, you might say, revolution in the Atlantic world in the 1700s. Anyone know which book I have in mind? Pardon?
Gerald Horne, he writes a lot
Well, Gerald Horne is another example. Well, there is evidence that there was a lot of people were revolutionary, or at least potentially revolutionary, including pirates and people like that, and runaway slaves, and runaway white folks who basically joined the natives and went native. You know what I mean? Like as happened in Florida and elsewhere, right? And for example, also in Canada, the Métis, basically the people that were half French and half Indian. And a lot of these were very, very unhappy again, or were victimized and therefore needed to respond. Few of these people really wanted, again, weren't revolutionary because they felt like making a revolution, but they were, again, people become revolutionary when they're pauperized, when they're victimized, when they're pushed with their backs against the wall and they haven't seen no other way of getting by, of surviving, of feeding their families and their children, So there's a lot of these movements in the past. Many of them did not come to fruition. Many of them were repressed to death. Others veered off and basically died off somewhere like fruit on the vine. They didn't ever make it. And sometimes, for that reason, that some je ne sais quoi, it did congeal. It did become a real revolution. You got to keep in mind also when these revolutions happened that the people who start to come out in the street, they don't have an objective of making a revolution. The tragedy of the revolutionaries in France in 1789 was in a way that they knew why they were in the streets and they knew what they wanted, cheaper bread. But none of them really thought of another country. They had no vision of another alternative to the monarchical state. In fact, even when they come back from Versailles, they bring back the baker. They still thought the king was the guy who was the legitimate lord of the land, and he was going to do something to make bread cheaper, right? It's only later that they realize he's useless and he's actually the enemy. So we're going to have to get rid of him, right? And that's a different thing again. And then that's how the idea emerged of another state, a republic, as opposed to monarchy and so forth. But I'm just saying, the ordinary people who made the revolution and who did most of the hard work for the revolution and paid the price for the revolution, made the sacrifices, had no clear plan. But that would change, wouldn't it? When after 1948, Karl Marx would formulate an ideology. And many of these would-be revolutionaries did have a plan and actually spoke loudly about their plan, would then scare the hell out of the bourgeoisie and cause them to want a war to avoid revolution. That was the First World War. But so it's very interesting. And I must say, I found that a very interesting read, Gerald Horne's book, for example, on how some of these, some people participating in that rebellion, which the American Revolution was, were still actually potential revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. So there was a bit of revolution in the rebellion of the American Revolution, And of course, there's also rebelliousness in revolutions, It's like, the yin and yang, right? There's a bit of both, Okay, so I'm not sure that's a bit of an answer, but it's worth, wrapping your mind around sometimes.
Thank you very much for this really interesting talk. I was hoping you could say more about the relationship between bourgeois and Bonapartist visions of Paris. Between bourgeois and Bonapartist visions of Paris, particularly as it relates to efforts to remake the city after the coup of Brumaire, and how this reflects on the distinct visions by different sections of the French bourgeoisie. Because of course you have the whole financial bourgeoisie of the July Monarchy, then you have the industrial bourgeoisie of the Third Republic, and of course, Haussmannian Paris and the Republic Paris, similar projects, but also distinctions. So
well, in my book, there's a chapter actually explaining all that. The bourgeoisie, Napoleon, essentially, was Napoleon bourgeois or was he nobility? Do you know? He was what? Well, you ask me, I'm asking you. You would think that the answer would be simple, that everybody would be able to know. But I'm sure if I ask a Frenchman, they would say, no, they don't know. Well, he was what you want him to be. Meaning, he was a bit of an unknown, an outsider. He came from Corsica, right? Which had only been part of France for 10 years when the revolution broke out. And he was from a family, if you visit his home in Ajaccio, go sometimes, I've been there a few times, you could describe it as very low ladder of the aristocracy, but a pretty high ladder of the bourgeoisie. So if you want to be from a family that was haut bourgeois, grand bourgeois, yeah, you're right. But if you prefer to see him as a sort of a lower aristocrat, that's fine too, whatever. They would live on the cusp, a bit of both. So it might bourgeois, but some aristocratic pretensions, or basically aristocrats with a bourgeois lifestyle, But he certainly could identify with the bourgeoisie. And when he came to Paris to study, to become an officer at the École Militaire, and the revolution happened, and he was a young officer, he sympathized with the revolution. Because many people who sympathized with, he was bourgeoisie, he was the bourgeois, because as an aristocrat, he would not have sympathized with it. So the bourgeois comes out now as a young man. And of course, was a bit of an enfant terrible, as the French say, I imagine, And he actually, as the revolution makes progress, he sympathizes with the radical revolution. He becomes a Jacobin, right? And because of that, actually, he risks getting into trouble when the Jacobins pay the price, after Robespierre is eliminated, and Jacobins are persecuted, especially those that have been a bit too outspoken in their radicalism. But fortunately, because of his connections, mainly with his wife, former mistress of some of these guys, he basically says, no, I was not. And then he becomes committed to the cause of the bourgeoisie, meaning stop the revolution. He's a revolutionary. He's not a monarchist. Doesn't want to go back to the Ancien regime. And he then, because of his contacts, they forgive him his Jacobin past, and he becomes a successful general on behalf of the revolution. As wars are now being used by these moderate revolutionaries to prevent the radical revolution, prevent the further radicalization. So war is the method now of doing it. And he's good at it, okay? He's good at it. And in the meantime, so he goes off to win victories in Italy and all over the place, and he goes to Egypt where he loses mostly, but comes back and he spin his expedition into a triumph, right? But I mean, that's happens sometimes. Even if you lose, if you have the right people, you can proclaim it to be a victory. And then the system, the regime that has been established, the Thermidorian regime, that was established to stop the revolution from continuing and basically keep it right there. They're in trouble because they're basically challenged by both the radicals that are still around, Jacobins, and the counter-revolutionaries, And they tried with a democratic system because they're somehow supposed to organize elections, but the bourgeoisie knows we can never win the elections, So eventually the idea is to a coup d'etat by a guy that we can count on. And they orchestrate a ludicrous coup d'etat that everyone can see. It's just basically a charade. And they bring him to power. Because why? But he has a reputation he has this charisma, as they call it, that je ne sais quoi, because he became famous for his victories, right? He was popular. And of course, a former popular former general can often win an election. Think of Eisenhower or some guy like that, that they bring out, and people vote for him because they've been taught to admire him, right? And he comes to power. But he doesn't come to power. He's brought to power. Much like Hitler will not come to power on his own, he will be put into the saddle of power by powerful people that prefer to remain anonymous in the background, okay? And that's the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie puts Napoleon into power to do what the bourgeoisie wants to do, to make sure that the counter-revolution is kept at bay, to make sure the radicals are eliminated, and to make sure that the state now, the Napoleonic state, is at the service of the bourgeoisie. And Napoleon does exactly that. He established the Bank of France, for example, which is not a state organization, it's a private organization. It's the private bankers essentially loaning money to him to finance his operations, to finance his wars, to finance his palaces, but he has to pay back. So for them, it's a wonderful investment, essentially, And in many other ways, he also, for example, the bourgeoisie is patriarchal, so they basically draw up the Code Civil, basically an entire body of statutes, of laws, and where women have no rights, men have rights, and that's what the bourgeoisie wants, that's what Napoleon wants. So the bourgeoisie basically is the power behind Napoleon. Napoleon's the facade. But they like it that you believe that he's the power. They like it that they like it that historians present it as if he's the guy who done it. Just like they like it like you to believe that in 1933, all that misery with the war, it's all Hitler's fault, you know. He's the guy. Nobody else. It's him. Fortunately, he's dead, you know. So we don't have to talk about, for example, the big German industrialists and bankers that brought him to power. They can say it wasn't us, you know. Plausible deniability, you know. It was him. So similarly, Napoleon is the golden boy. He's the protector, you know, the icon later on, you know, of the bourgeoisie. And when the bourgeoisie bourgeoisifies Paris, leading to the building of the Eiffel Tower, it Napoleonizes it. Because the bourgeoisie doesn't have any much glory to, can't put a veneer of glory on the architecture. But Napoleonic glory does the job. So big monuments, mostly martial monuments, you know. The idea that the bourgeoisie is for peace, you know, it's also BS. It's not true. They like wars. Wars are very profitable. The bourgeoisie in France made a lot of money thanks to the Napoleonic Wars. The wars basically took away the potentially troublesome potential revolutionaries. You know, they went off to Moscow and never came back. And the wars made a lot of money, right? And that is why Napoleon was the golden boy and remained the golden boy of the French bourgeoisie throughout the 19th century to this very day. You all know Pierre Bourdieu, don't you, the sociologist? It's wonderful. I wish I knew where exactly, but he wrote a book, La Distinction. And in it, he describes somewhere in one of his books, he describes how the French bourgeoisie, for example, when you go to a French town and you go into the marketplace, for example, there'll be a nice bar there, you know, very comfortable, expensive, where the bourgeoisie meets. You know, the mayor will come there, you know, and the lawyers, you know, and the doctors, you know, and they have their own table. You wouldn't dare come sit next to them. It's private property, right? You know, and they have sip champagne, I guess, and it'll be called Le Bonaparte. And if you're not part of the bourgeoisie, you better not go there, you know, because of high prices, you know. And then if you want to go to where the lower class goes, you go to another place to a bar called L'Avenir, you know, or the future. And if we someday we'll be rich, we'll be able to go to Le Bonaparte. You know? But I mean, the point Bourdieu is making essentially is that Napoleon's fame, his career was made possible by the bourgeoisie, and his career was in the service of the bourgeoisie. And as a result of that, he's still the golden boy of the bourgeoisie. And he, in spite of his crimes, of his terror, of bringing back slavery, he's got statues all over the place. And Robespierre, zero. Yeah. So go figure. Well, it's the Second Empire is pretty well the same thing. In 1848, there was a revolution again. And the major concessions had to be made, including the final, definitive abolition of slavery. But then again, the revolutionaries, the working class revolutionaries, were making demands for major changes in terms of, for example, economic changes, interference with the market, which is sacrosanct market, and that had to be repressed. And it was repressed, but one of the major achievements of the revolution was the introduction of universal suffrage, okay? And that was a problem because they could not easily abolish that. And that is actually very important because that's when the bourgeoisie, capitalism, anywhere in the world had to learn to live with universal suffrage. It's hard to make you believe, to pretend you have a democracy if you don't have universal suffrage, And how can you resolve the problem? The fact that you, the bourgeoisie, are only 10% at most of the population, and ordinary people are 80% or 90%, right? And the answer is what they call now what Bonapartism. And Lasurdo has written a wonderful book about that, Bonapartism. Bonapartism is the idea of presenting a candidate who has a big name, is famous, and whom people will vote for. Why? Because of the name. Because the name, not because they have no idea what it stands for, really. But we put forward somebody, we the bourgeoisie put forward somebody who we know we can count on. And at that stage, looking for a candidate, as they had looked for a candidate earlier, whom happened to be the first Bonaparte, now actually they realize he has a nephew, another Bonaparte, they're going to bring him in. And Marx has famously written about that, and they bring in Bonaparte, right? And he wins the elections. Why? Big name, it's like saying, bring in a big football player, in the old days, Maradona would definitely have been elected president of Argentina, right? Undoubtedly, right? Yeah, exactly. So being a movie star, right? Being a movie star, a pretty face, like a wonderful model. Brigitte Bardot probably would have been elected president of France at one point. You know what I'm saying? And that's how they bring him in. And they bring him in, but then to be safe, he proclaims himself emperor, coup d'etat again. So at least history repeated itself, but more as a farce, as Marx would have said, than as an actual repetition, as a drama, right? So yeah, so that's how it works. And ever since then, Bonapartism, the idea of bringing in somebody, a candidate who has a big name and who's then promoted also, of course, flogged on TV. Sometimes you wonder how they come up with some of these candidates, right? Somebody they never heard of, like Obama. I'd never heard of Obama, and suddenly, boy, he was there, and there was a great guy, fantastic, and oh my God, like people was crying, so impressed. They're manufactured now. Now we manufacture, guys that are going to win elections, right? Anyways, so that was Bonaparte. If anybody here is called Bonaparte, I recommend going into politics in France, because I think there's going to be a job vacant here at the Élysée Palace sometime soon. Better come up with somebody else.
You have a question? Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Jacques, for taking that. And thanks to everyone for listening and for really thoughtful questions and engaging with the book. Yeah, if you want to engage with the book more, it's behind me. Go and take a look. And there's a few other titles as well. So I just want to close up and say thanks again to the Critical Theory Workshop for inviting us. Thanks to Jacques for visiting us. And everyone, if you give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
We'll do a 15-20-minute break, and books in the back. You might even be able to get Jacques to sign one, and otherwise we'll meet back here in front of us.
David.
Yeah.
Great job.
Yes.
Also, are we talking about where the